Sí, sí, sí. Muchas gracias, Director Julio Hang, Director Instituto de Seguridad Internacional de CARI, mis colegas Virginia Dama y Gladys Lacini, miembros del Gobierno y Armada de la Argentina y miembros de cuerpos diplomáticos, señoras y señores. Excuse me if I speak in English, which I'm going to do for two reasons. A, it's better than my Spanish. But B, by speaking English to you, making a virtue out of necessity, I will also illustrate one of, I think, the last remaining barriers that broadly separates the Francophone and Anglophone countries of Africa from Spanish-speaking South America. I exclude from this, of course, the Portuguese-speaking countries of Africa and Brazil, because they have an obvious point of commonality. And apart from improving my Spanish, and arguably some of your English by the end of this talk, I would like to do something else, and that is to, at this rather imperfect map, unfortunately Mr. Google hasn't, many things he's done, hasn't managed to bridge the space across the South Atlantic. You will see there that if you look from South Africa, the view from South Africa and Africa broadly tends to be to look north. So the traditional view in Africa looked towards Europe. That's where actually the colonization happened from, and the United States, the fount of all our movies, technology, and much else besides, and a third of the world's economic power still. And in South America, there's also a tendency to look north, rather than the continents of Africa to start looking west and the countries of South America to start looking east. And that, of course, I think is the challenge, is to not just realign our strategies, but perhaps to change our thinking. Certainly, it is the core part of my job and my colleagues. I'm joined here today by our newly arrived, appropriately enough, naval captain, Sonica van Rooyen. You'll recognize her for obvious reasons. And her husband, who's also not in uniform, who's also a naval captain, Frank van Rooyen, who contributed a lot of ideas to this talk today. I'm in complete agreement with both what Virginia and Gladys said this morning, and I think we are very privileged, speaking as a South African and an African, to have two such experts who have not just an interest in Africa, but can actually articulate it in the southern cone of South America as well as they do. And I'm very grateful for that fact. There are just 2 points I would make in introduction before getting into the substance. And one of them relates to the title of my address, because Julio and our very good friends at CARI were kind enough to tell me what I should talk about, which is always good, because I love to quote my friend, the Indian ambassador to Argentina, Mr. Vistranathan, who always says, an ambassador is somebody who thinks twice before he says nothing. So the advantage CARI has is they tell you what to say. So you've got to say something. Before I do that, there's just, if you can see that map, there are two very interesting points. Sub-Saharan Africa, not just the west coast of it, consists of 47 countries, más o menos. Sudamerica, más o menos, próximo 12 países. So immediately you see a lot of the problems that Virginia and Gladys were alluding to are in that complexity. That with all the challenges and issues South America faces, it's a more viable political concept to have a dozen countries rather than 47 in approximately the same landmass. And that goes to the very point I think that Virginia made, and Gladys, is that actually the levels of development in sub-Saharan Africa, even along the west coast of it, are vastly different. In South America, if I might make a generalization, the levels of development, I'm not talking economically, but certainly politically, certainly in terms of the tradition of independence, have more or less marched along the same path. So when we talk about the view or the vision of Africa, that's a big thing, because although Africa aspires to unite, and we have these instruments, which Virginia drew attention to, as did Gladys, like the African Union, which is a pan-African concept. The reality is vastly different individual national experiences in Africa, and to talk about Africa is more an aspiration than it is a reality of everyday political and economic fact. Now, of course, you can make the same point about an ocean, and that's after all what we're talking about. We often talk in English. Someone said to me, English is a more precise language than Spanish. I don't think that's true. I always got to think it was rather, this is not a sexist joke, I tell it to my wife, but it's applied. Someone said that, you know, English is very precise, and there are two words that mean the same thing, such as complete and finish. Well, in English, much the same thing. So when you meet the right woman, you are complete. When you meet the wrong woman, you are finished. If the right woman finds with the wrong woman, then you are completely finished. But anyway, I'll leave that to one side. So when we talk about oceans, we often say that continents and areas are separated by oceans. But you can also say, in another way, that oceans are connected with each other, and therefore an ocean becomes a bridge of friendship between diverse cultures. And that's really, I think, the way that I would like to approach my talk this morning. And certainly as an aspiration for the enhanced South Atlantic region, that I think is a very good view. Now you can see from the map that the South Atlantic is encircled by the regions of the American and African continents, with the closest points between, I'm sorry, the pointer, two continents appears to be Pau Pesao in Brazil and Port Gentil in Gabon, up there, as it were. The South Atlantic, of course, is ringed by the countries of the east coast of South America, and we, of course, in Argentina today, but also Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile, and then in southern Africa's west coast, from Sao Tome and Principe and Gabon at the top, right down to South Africa, as it were, at the bottom. And then, of course, we have dozens of islands in between. Some are inhospitable, some have exotic names, and one of them in particular is subject of a sovereignty dispute at the moment, but I won't go into that here at this diplomatic gathering today. But it is obviously much in the news. Now, the naval thinker and strategist Albert Mahan once said, "The first and most obvious light in which the sea presents itself from a political and social point of view is that of a great highway, or better perhaps of a wide common, over which men," this is before feminism had entered the discourse, "may pass in all directions, but on which some well-known paths show that controlling reasons of travel rather than others. These lines of travel are called trade routes, and the reasons which then are to be sought in the history of the world." Now it's quite interesting because there you had long ago the first intimation, if you like, of what we've come today to commonly refer to as globalization. So trade's the one thing. The other thing, of course, is strategy. And there is no doubt that part of what we in Argentina and South Africa and many of the African and South American states call the South is not just a physical construct. It's also an ideological and a defensive construct, precisely because during much of the Cold War, which was the defining features of the second half of the 20th century, the southern countries were pushed down the periphery because the concentration of strategic interest and terror even was in the north rather than the South Atlantic. But of course, by today we still have the famous acronym NATO, and with all the words and alliances that have entered the vocabulary of acronyms, we've never established something in the South that is quite as powerful a concept as NATO. Whatever the limits of NATO might be today in the deserts of North Africa, it still, as a construct, was one of the most durable instruments created after the Second World War and until this century. Now, Without, at the risk of being a bit of a bore, I'll try and skip over some of the things that have already been said. I think the features that we have in common on the South Atlantic, leaving aside ideology, history, politics, of course, are the physical attributes of the ocean. Now, if you actually look slightly below the sea, the surface, at what they are, we see there's an enormously rich and significant world down there. The obvious one are what we call broadly submarine hydrocarbons, which is the wealth of petroleum and natural gas, which lies underneath the continental shelves and slopes and the oceanic rises and plateaus of the Atlantic basin and portions of its marginal seas. Now, here, on the history that we have so far, or the recording of it, the volume of recoverables in terms of these resources has been very impressive. In fact, on one of the studies that Captain Van Rooyen, Frank Van Rooyen, unearthed for me in his research, the estimate is that for the whole of the Atlantic, we have as much as 1/3 of the projected total for all of the world's oil and gas that are capable of extraction. Now, of course, it's got to be extracted, and while we're noticing with interest what is going on off the coast of Brazil at the moment, which is establishing a lot of interest and a lot of investment, that obviously has to be exploited elsewhere. But certainly, in terms of non-renewable resources, this, I think, is going to play a transformative role in the future. Now, most of the recoverable oil and natural gas are concentrated in 4 regions of the South, two of which are within the South Atlantic. The west central coast of Africa, particularly the Niger River Delta region, off the coast and off the coast of Gabon and Cabinda, the so-called Angola enclave, while Argentina, Bovet Island, Brazil, the Malvinas Islands, and Uruguay have, of course, as you know, extensive oil and gas profiles. The second, as it were, trove of mineral wealth is much more inconsistent, and that is so-called alluvial deposits, the accumulation of valuable minerals formed by gravity separation during the sedimentary processes, to give it its geological definition. Metallic ores such as iron, tin, titanium, and chromium, and gemstones. These are found at a number of points in the South Atlantic, particularly Brazil and Namibia, where diamond dredging is fairly common. Then, of course, we have the third category, which are so-called deep-sea minerals, where regions of the ocean floor are covered with metallic nodules, formed in concentric layers over millennia. They are composed of manganese and iron, to a lesser degree with quantities of copper, nickel, and cobalt. In the South Atlantic, the main concentrations here are in the Brazil Basin and the Gullis Basin south of South Africa. Difficult to exploit these at commercially viable rates. Then, of course, we have what's already been mentioned in some detail, the question of fisheries, which the water here, the particular concentrations of it, particularly off Western Africa and off the coast of Southeast and South America and Southern Africa, are the sites of very large plankton concentrations, which form the basis of much of the Atlantic's abundant fishing areas. Now, the major fishing grounds of the South Atlantic represent more than half the world's total, long often considered the most productive of all the oceans. But, as you know, these have now been extensively fished, and it's thought to be sustainable over the long or even the medium term. And for the second half of the 20th century, while the Atlantic has remained fairly constant, the overall marine catch was reduced from more than half in the 1950s to roughly 1/5 at the time, by the time the global catch reached a plateau in the early part of the 21st century. Apart from the Southwest Atlantic region, the other 5 regions have been classified as overexploited to the extent they are unable to replenish themselves fully through natural reproduction. Many countries, not only in the South Atlantic, have been attempting to protect, with various degrees of success, managing the level of fishing in their territorial waters and the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zones. And that, of course, has led to a fair amount of work for our respective navies. Then the more, less, perhaps the most sustainable economic activity of all, on both sides of the South Atlantic, is marine tourism. And as I have had the great pleasure of going myself while I've been here to Puerto Madryn to see the marvelous Peninsula de Valdez, I think I am a walking advertisement for the marine tourism of Argentina. I can tell you equally, in southern Africa, there are great marine touristic sites, although I have to say that it is more the combined qualities of Diego Maradona and Lionel Messi, which led to a 130% increase of Argentines visiting South Africa last year, than any other time in our history, and certainly compared to the year before. Let me just add on tourism generally, and trade and everything else. The restoration of airlinks between Argentina and South Africa in 2008, I think, has been one of the most signal and significant factors in bringing our two parts of the world close together. There are now 5 flights a week from South Africa to Argentina, and 7 flights a week between South Africa and Sao Paulo, Brazil. I think the fact that there are 12 points of entry every week between South Africa and South America, and obviously other parts of Africa, less so, but Angola and Portugal certainly, is to me a very, very significant step forward. Now, we're not here to talk about airlinks, we're talking more about marine trade and transportation, but that, of course, the passage of ships led to the greatest exploitation, if you like, both ends of the ocean, which was the slave, the passage of slaves between the west coast of Africa and the east coast of South America. But of course that was the harbinger of much closer cultural cooperation, albeit initially of the enforced kind, between the two continents. Now, there are a number of, leaving aside the geological and the cultural elements, there are a number of politico-security attributes which I should also touch on, which my 2 colleagues here have mentioned, I think, with great adeptness this morning. The first is, that I mentioned it, the concept of the global south, which is as much geographic as it is ideological, and it does refer to countries in various stages of development. But if at the beginning of my talk I mentioned that economically and from a decolonization point of view, the experiences of Africa and South America are very different. Actually, the experience that is quite similar and happened in more or less the same time frame has been the advent of democratization and so-called democratic deepening. That actually came late to Africa. It also came, in its true sense, fairly late to South America, though obviously there was a more of a democratic hinterland in South America than there was in Africa. If you go back 100 plus years ago, there was a lot of what you might call, I don't know if there's a term in Spanish, but in English, democratic interruptions in South America. We now know that democracy is the normal course of events in South America. In Africa, that would be a stretch. You can't say democracy is the normal course of events, because there are some parts of Africa that are profoundly undemocratic. But certainly, everyone, whether it's in Africa or South America, at least bows towards the concept of democracy and democratic transformation, even if it is not always practiced in the best sense of the word.